Hello and good afternoon in the UK. This is Mick Napier here for the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I just happen this week to be speaking to you from Shanghai, China, where it's almost midnight. But in Brussels, David Cronin is only an hour ahead of the UK, and it's a real pleasure to invite David to join us for the weekly interview now. David, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mick.
David is the author of a lot of important stuff on the issue of Israel-Palestine. He actually came to speak in Scotland on one of his books, Balfour's Shadow, which details that long, dark shadow from the birthing of the crisis in Palestine to the present day, and what the legacy has been and why. But he's mainly a journalist reporting on European politics from Brussels, where he is at the moment. We mistakenly had him back in Dublin, where he originates from, but he now works as well as reports from Brussels. David, it couldn't be a hotter potato, the EU and its relationships with Britain and Ireland than at the moment, but let's shed some light in terms of the relationship with Israel. We had somebody who was rebuffed vigorously a couple of years ago, Priti Patel, when she suggested redirecting British government humanitarian aid to the Israeli military. That was seen as a step too far, even for those who were very determined supporters of Israel. But you told a story recently in the Electronic Intifada about EU aid now going directly to the Israeli army. Could you start off your comments by talking about that, David?
Sure, just a clarification. The European, I'm not aware of the European Union giving money directly to the Israeli military, but it's come pretty close to that. I recently discovered, after a long trawl of the European Union's scientific research program, or Horizon 2020, that it's known, that the European Union has begun giving money directly to Israel's defense ministry, which of course is the ministry in charge of the Israeli army and in charge of strategy and various other strategy and various administrative issues concerning the Israeli military. So it might as well be giving money directly to the Israeli.
And you report that it involves the use of drones. Correct. But there's an alleged element of humanitarian motivation behind it.
Exactly. The purpose, the name of the project involving the Israeli Defense Ministry is called Respondrome, if memory serves me correctly, and its stated objective is to examine how drones, militarized drones, can be used in rescue operations, emergency operations responding to disasters, etc. And so it's obviously presented as a benign humanitarian project, but as well as involving the Israeli Defense Ministry, I think there's actually three Israeli partners in this particular project. Another Israeli partner in it is one of the major Israeli weapons manufacturers. It's either Elbit or Israel Aerospace Industries. I don't have it in front of me, but it's one of those two, which are, of course, I think it's Israel Aerospace Industries, which is one of the key suppliers of drones and other warplanes and various other forms of weapons to the Israeli military. So, and the products of which have been directly used in attacks on men, women, and children in Gaza.
So just to make sure we got this right, David, a lot of people are waving EU flags now out of revulsion at Priti Patel and Boris Johnson and the new lot in the British government. But you're telling me that EU money has gone to the Ministry of Defence in Israel, supposedly to use military drones, possibly the same drones that are used to devastate parts of Gaza in order to develop a humanitarian capability elsewhere. Is that right? Or is this, has somebody dreamt this up in a dark novel?
That's my understanding. Of the article you mentioned is on the Electronic Intifada website, and there's, if anybody who wants to read it will see that there's a link in that article to the actual project, to the description of the project on the European Union's own website, the European Commission's own website for Horizon 2020, the science program that I mentioned. So if I've got anything wrong, people are invited to correct me, but I've contacted the European Commission about this themselves, and they have confirmed to me that this is the only project in which the Israeli Defense Ministry has got money under the from the EU scientific research activities, and as far as I can see, it's the first project involving the Israeli Defense Ministry. But I think it's a very dangerous, it sets an extremely dangerous precedent. It's not surprising. I wasn't surprised to learn it, but obviously I was still shocked to learn it. I didn't think that the European Union was going to go quite this far in terms of its support for Israel. There's a logic behind why it should. But I still didn't think that they would actually go as far as to rubber stamp projects involving the ministry in charge of overseeing Israel's crimes against humanity.
David, you bring an Irish sensibility to this. You did to the novel, to your work, Balfour Shadow, and you drew parallels. You drew links in terms of actual personnel between the repression of the drive for Irish independence and the repression of the Palestinians. Look, a lot of people feel the need to believe that the EU is not as bad as America, that whereas Trump and before him Obama was donating billion after billion to Israeli apartheid, the EU was relatively a good guy. But your work shows that the EU's role is actually far from comforting for those of us who support Palestinian rights. Can you just develop that broadly, David?
I'd actually argue, Mick, that I think Donald Trump, this might surprise people what I'm going to say, but he's not an honest man. But in some respects, he's more honest than the European Union's representatives. At least when he talks about Israel, he doesn't. He doesn't make. When you listen to Donald Trump talking about Israel, whatever else he might say on other issues, whatever lies he tells in general, when he talks about Israel, he's quite honest in saying that he supports Israel 100%, or perhaps even more than that. The European Union has this very nice, soft rhetoric. But in fact, its support for Israel is pretty extreme also. Not as extreme as the American support. I mean, we mentioned earlier that the European Union is now giving money to the Israeli Defense Ministry, which means that it's actually emulating in some respect the United States. Of course, the United States gives almost $4 billion in military aid to Israel per year. So the fact that the European Union is now giving a type of what can be described as military aid, as kind of subtle military aid or stealthy military aid to Israel, or at least is increasing it, at least has embraced financially the Israeli military industrial complex, suggests that it's kind of playing catch up almost with the United States, and obviously a long time before. There's a huge difference between 4 billion and the relatively small amount that the European Union is giving, but it's symbolically important. But as well, this is not an isolated case. So that's the point I just want to make. Trump has obviously, one of the worst things he's done has been to move the embassy from Tel Aviv. America's embassy to Israel has been moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Many European, not all, but many European Union states criticized that move at the United Nations. But in spite of the fact that they are criticizing this, and in spite of the fact they're saying that they are against anything that would change the status of East Jerusalem, the European Union is still getting into bed with Israeli bodies that are based in some cases, and in many other cases, very active in East Jerusalem. For example, Europol, the European Union Police Cooperation Agency, cooperates with the Israeli National Police, which has its headquarters in Sheikh Jarrah, part of occupied East Jerusalem. The European Union has also given a number of scientific research grants to Israel's public security ministry. In inverted, that's its official name, but I'm using air quotes because it's. I don't think that public. I think Israel has used the terms public security in a pretty Orwellian fashion. The public security ministry is in charge of police and prisons. It's in charge of a police force which has been active in raids against Palestinians in East Jerusalem and elsewhere in the occupied West Bank, has been involved actively in home demolitions recently and in going back over many years in East Jerusalem and elsewhere. So the European Union might claim to have a better record, maybe has a better record than the Americans on this, but it's a record, unfortunately, of hypocrisy. Trump is actually more straightforward. It's easier. It's much easier to understand where he's coming from on this particular issue. Leaving aside many other things, on this particular issue.
No, we're not picking up that you're a Trump fan, but you're absolutely right. He can afford to be honest to his white supremacist supporters. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Please continue.
The European Union, it's often says the right things, and often will get an angry response from Israeli ministers. But when he was in power, when he was the foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman, on a number of occasions criticized the European Union and essentially alleged that the European Union was anti-Semitic because of some criticisms it had made of Israel's settlement activities.
But David, you must be aware. Maybe it's before you started patrolling Brussels as a journalist, but you must be aware of. I often find myself referring to it, an EU commissioned opinion poll. I think it was 2006, which concluded that the opinions of European citizens in every country were very hostile to Israel and saw it as a really huge, if not the greatest threat to world peace, right? I think 59% of people put it top. The EU apologized to Israel for the opinions of EU citizens, did they not? And Israel said Europe's awash with anti-Semitism, blah, blah, blah. So is there a continuity there? I mean, what?
Yeah. In fact, that opinion poll, it was conducted by Eurobarometer. I thought it was actually earlier than that, but you may well have the date correct. I don't recall the precise date. I thought it was 2004 or 2005, around that time. But it's, in any event, it was funded by the European Union itself, and it came to the conclusion that a majority of people asked a particular question about what did they perceive as the nation in the world which was most hostile to peace, and a majority, in their wisdom, a majority of respondents named Israel. And this
59% of Europeans virtually in every country. Yeah,
that sounds correct. I don't have it in front of me, but that actually, interestingly enough, there's been a lot of talk recently about defining anti-Semitism and so on. But because of the controversy engendered by that opinion poll because of the fact that the pro-Israel lobby made it made the findings of this poll so controversial. The European Union got together and tried to launched this exercise to work out a definition of anti-Semitism. Now, this exercise was by no means a scientific exercise. What actually happened was that a few, in most cases, quite hawkish pro-Israel groups in Europe and the United States, and I think also inside Israel itself, were invited to give suggestions about how anti-Semitism should be defined. And what they ended up with was this so-called working definition of anti-Semitism, which conflated robust criticism of Israel with bigotry against Jews. It was accompanied by several examples of anti-Semitism. Among them, for example, were any suggestion that the founding of the State of Israel was a racist endeavor, and also any comparisons whatsoever between Israel and the Nazis were considered anti-Semitic. This definition was never actually formally adopted by the European Union, and in fact was actually removed at one point from the website of the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency in Vienna, which was under a previous guise had actually been in charge of administering this exercise. So perhaps naively, some people thought that might be the end of the story for this particular definition, but it actually was resurrected a couple of years ago and has now been approved by an intergovernmental body, which I think has 33 member states. The name of the intergovernmental body is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or the IHRA. And the definition that it has adopted is 99.9% identical. I think I've actually compared the text, and there's like one or two words different between the one that was drawn up as part of the European Union.
David, this is fascinating. Are you saying, a lot of people know all about that, but are you saying that the original impetus for what was the EUMC working definition morphed into the IHRA? Are you saying the impetus to that was very clearly the chins hitting the floor among the pro-Israel group after the EU opinion poll, and that it was the EU opinion poll that galvanized them to begin the work that's led to the IHRA today? Can you see a very clear line between the poll?
Absolutely. It was part of that. It was part of that response to that controversy over the opinion poll that you mentioned a few moments ago. The other thing that I think many people don't realize is that the famous IHRA, or perhaps infamous IHRA definition, was actually written by pro-Israel lobby groups. It's by no means an objective definition of anti-Semitism. Why do we need a definition of anti-Semitism anyway? The Oxford English Dictionary and other dictionaries have quite simple definitions of anti-Semitism. They define it quite simply and quite accurately as hostility or bigotry against Jews. I don't have the precise text in front of me, but it's along those lines, the definition in the Oxford English.
David, let me bring you back to EU policy and practice. Mm-hmm. The barbarity of what Israel does is now becoming very clear and difficult to sweep under the carpet. UK government policy officially is that the settlements in the West Bank, the colonies, are war crimes against the Geneva Convention. That's the official position, but you couldn't drag it out of them with a pair of pliers. I mean, they don't want to talk about it while they arm Israel to do what it does. And I believe the EU policy is the same, formally in support of the right of return that was never abrogated, but just let's not talk about it. Is that, have I got that right?
I think that's fair. Yeah, the European Union recently, I've seen spokespeople refer to Israel's settlement policies as unhelpful, which, if memory serves me correctly, is identical to the language that Hillary Clinton used to use when she was America's foreign secretary or secretary of state. You know, unhelpful is a kind of term you use if you're not happy with service in a restaurant. You know, it's hardly appropriate terminology to use to describe what are actually war crimes and what are actually violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So I think even at a rhetorical level, the European Union's policies have become weaker. And of course, so, there's all this concrete stuff happening as well, where the European Union is actively embracing Israel.
David, you must attend all sorts of Brussels EU briefing events and so on. I have only ever been to one. I was over in Brussels for something else on Palestine, and friends got me along to a report back by the EU working group or investigation group on human rights inside Israel, Palestinian human rights. And there we heard a report, and I kid you not, they did report accurately that in some Israeli government ministries, whereas 20%, 25% of the population are Palestinians, there were 0 Palestinians, or maybe 1 in 1,000. And when the inquiry team from the EU asked the Israeli government why there were no Palestinians, only Jews in these jobs, they were told that Palestinians really didn't want to work in these jobs, and Israel was trying its hardest to persuade them to take up some of the jobs. And the response wasn't laughter or ridicule, what everybody knows is a cynical, piece of nonsense. That just gets buried. So I guess my question is, how does the EU try to present a facade of benign attitudes, not as bad as the USA, in the face of the massacres in the Great March of Return, the bulldozers, the full spectrum criminality? How is that nuanced in Brussels to try to maintain the facade or the charade?
I wish I had a simple answer to that. I mean, there's fundamental contradictions going on here. Of course, I mean, the European Union has repeated. The European Union representatives have repeated nonsense so often that I suspect that some of them have swallowed it. The European Union's mantra, the mantra of its representatives, is that we support the two-state solution. They say this at every conceivable opportunity. Yet, unless they're stupid, and I don't believe they are stupid, you only have to look at what's happening on the ground to realize that the chances of there being a two-state solution are pretty much non-existent at the moment, and leaving aside the question of whether a two-state solution would be just or desirable. Even in terms of hard-headed realpolitik, the idea that a two-state solution can somehow be magicked into reality is fantasy. Pure and absolute fantasy. Yet still, when the last time I heard Federica Mogherini, the European Union's foreign policy chief, talking about Palestine, she was reiterating her firm commitment to a two-state solution. So it's become like a religious, almost a religious tenet, I think, for European Union representatives, that they have to say these kind of things. I suppose one of the one possible explanation, and this is on I'm perfectly open to other people's opinions on this, is that the European Union is of course a country of is of course a grouping of is it 27 or 28 at the moment? Of course, one of those will be leaving. Looks set to be leaving on the 31st of October, and of course, different countries have different policies on the Middle East. Ireland and Sweden, for example, are somewhat more critical. Have tended to be somewhat more critical than the Netherlands and the Czech Republic, which are pretty much at the other extreme. Maybe Hungary, actually, also Poland. Poland, we can perhaps talk about them, which is interesting, given that they both have very right-wing governments, yet are very supportive of Israel. So what you hear coming from the mouths of Federica Mogherini and her colleagues here in Brussels is kind of lowest common denominator stuff, so she's obviously trying to keep everybody happy, and that's possibly why she comes out with this gobbledygook all the time. But just to come back to what I was saying earlier, the best word to describe the European Union's policy on Palestine is hypocrisy. They try to say the right things, yet they do all the wrong things. Worse than that, they're complicit. The European Union is complicit in Israel's crimes against humanity. Israeli researchers have received $820 million under the current EU scientific research program, Horizon 2020, which we mentioned earlier, and the European Union's representative.
Almost getting on for $1 billion.
It's still going. So but by the time it's wrapped up in the next year or so. I think we can confidently predict that Israel will have received more than $1 billion from it.
Billion.
Speaking in dollars, because I work for a website based in the United States, so I've converted figures from euros into dollars. But I think we can confidently predict that Israel will have received more than $1 billion dollars or euros from this program by the time it has wrapped up. And the European Union's embassy in Tel Aviv quite regularly organizes receptions to celebrate its support for Israeli entrepreneurs. There's no acknowledgement whatsoever during these events that the European Union, that among the recipients of this largesse are Israeli weapons manufacturers, are Israeli government ministries that are directly involved in the occupation, like the Public Security Ministry I mentioned earlier. The Public Security Ministry, I should add, is actually the ministry in charge of prisons. So it's the ministry. It could more accurately be described as the torture ministry. We know that we know that Palestinian prisoners are routinely tortured in Israel's prisons. Sometimes they are tortured to death, as happened with one particular guy recently, and has happened on many other occasions in the past. This is one of the ministries that the European Union is giving taxpayers.
David, we've got you here on our broadcast. You must pick up some gossip. Is there any sense that people are finding it increasingly difficult to defend what Israel does? So, for example, the Dutch gave a bunch of solar panels to a Palestinian village, and the Israelis either destroyed them or stole them. And that's happened a few times to EU funding or EU government's funding of infrastructure projects. Is there any sense that even individuals are getting pissed off? They have to maintain the facade, the hypocrisy. There's no choice, really, but they have to maintain that at state level. But are individuals saying, look, these guys are making it difficult for us to continue to arm them?
I think you were actually talking about Belgium there a second ago. In 2017, the Belgian government wrote a letter of protest about how Israel had destroyed some of the aid projects it was supporting in the occupied West Bank, and I think 7 or 8 other European Union countries supported that protest. But writing a letter is fine, but not surprisingly, the Israeli government. I'll try and keep things polite. The Israeli government just metaphorically just took that letter and threw it in the bin. They ignored it, because for the simple reason that if this to me is quite simple, and it's actually a litmus test. This is taxpayers' money. The European Union governments, the individual European Union governments and the European Union collectively are supposed to be accountable to taxpayers. So when Israel destroys, confiscates, attacks European Union funded projects, that's a direct attack on our pockets. So the very least that whether it be individual governments or the European Union collectively, depending on who has actually signed the checks, the very least they should be doing is calling up their solicitors and saying, we're going to sue Israel for this. But that hasn't happened.
It never happened, no?
To the best of my knowledge, I've been told of one particular case where the Israelis gave money back to I think it was to the World Food Programme, but I don't think they've ever given money back to the European Union for aid projects that they have destroyed. And this happened repeatedly. This has happened time and time again. Millions of euros, pounds, dollars, whatever currency you want to use, have been lost because of Israel's direct attacks on our money. So the European Union has, they can write all the letters that they want, but nobody will take these letters seriously unless they are prepared to actually back them up with real action, whether that be taking Israel to court or whether it be imposing sanctions on Israel. Ideally, it should be both.
David, can I change the subject to something else you've written about, which is the Christian fundamentalist, the Christian Zionist groups operating across Europe as pro-Israel lobby groups. We in Scotland had a particular interest. We had a guy called Nigel Goodrich, who's a Christian fundamentalist, but also very much an associate with some very extreme right-wing, actually fascist elements, people who really beat up and assault pro-Palestine elements. And he was caught out in a very dark, secret Facebook group with some seriously nasty people. And the Confederation of Friends of Israel in Scotland, which he founded, then assured people that they had broken off all links with him and he was cast into outer darkness. But we believe he's actually been promoted to Brussels. Do you know anything about that in terms of your wider study of these Christian Zionist groups?
I don't know very much, but I did hear Mr. What's his name? Goodrich, is it?
Goodrich.
Goodrich. Yeah. I did hear his name being mentioned as connected with a group called the Belgian Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which I think is a group headed by a man called Joel Rubenfeld. Joel Rubenfeld has been an active pro-Israel lobbyist here in Brussels for many years. I think most of his activities have been focused on sort of the Belgian government and so on, but he's also done some lobbying of the European Union institutions. He was involved in quite a dubious initiative called the European Jewish Parliament, a few years ago, which was well, it wasn't a real parliament by any stretch of the imagination. It was something that was its members were actually set up, were elected again in very, very big inverted commas by an online poll. He was one of the people who were elected to this. I interviewed him about this at the time, and he said it came as a surprise to him to hear he had been elected. But he was participating in this body, which was actually financed by I think it was two Ukrainian billionaires. One of whom has subsequently become a mayor or a head of a region in Ukraine. I can't remember the man's name. But when I interviewed Mr. Rubenfeld, he argued that he felt that boycotting Israel was, by definition, anti-Semitic, simply because Israel is a Jewish state. So this was the argument that he used. So he's one of these people who's been trying to smear the Palestine solidarity movement for a number of years, and has been bandying about allegations of anti-Semitism against Palestine.
At the founding meeting of Edinburgh, with Friends of Israel a few years ago, somebody in there reported it in a very friendly way, but lamented the fact, just said that over 90% of the people there were Christians, and there were very few Jews there in the founding of this Friends of Israel branch. Mm-hmm. Is that repeated across Europe? Are Christian Zionists an important part of the pro-Israel lobby?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think this is why I think. Well, first of all, I think time and time again, it should be emphasised that that's it's important that we refer to this lobby as the Israel lobby or the Zionist lobby, and not as a Jewish lobby. Sometimes people make that mistake. They often ignorance, but there's a number of reasons why obviously it's always important to use language as accurately as possible. But one of the reasons in this particular case why that's important is because the term Jewish lobby is actually inaccurate. The Israel lobby has a considerable Christian component, Christian Zionist component. Here in Brussels, yeah, there's the Christian Zionists are quite active. One of the objectives of the pro-Israel lobby here in Brussels has been to try and build up a presence within the EU institutions. And they've particularly been working very actively in the European Parliament. The European Parliament has, I think it's fair to say, very few, if any, Jewish elected representatives. I don't actually know of any at the moment. I haven't checked I haven't gone through the religious or ethnic origin of all the people elected in June, but there has been a concerted effort by the pro-Israel lobby to build up a support groups within the European Parliament, and I think it's fair to say that most of the people who've been attracted, most of the people who've joined these groups are Christians. Some of them are pretty much hardcore Christian Zionists, and some of them are, when I say hardcore Christian Zionists, I obviously mean that the people who've a certain interpretation of the Bible and so on, and they see the foundation of the state of Israel as the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy. But there are other representatives, other elective representatives who've joined support groups within the European Parliament, pro-Israel support groups within the European Parliament, that wouldn't necessarily have this extreme reading of the Bible, but would come from a broadly Christian Zionist perspective, and would be attracted to supporting Israel for that and other reasons, which have got to do obviously with what could broadly be termed white supremacy and so on, Islamophobia and so on. But it is true that some of the most hawkish supporters of Israel within the European Parliament have been hardcore Christian Zionists, and this has again led to quite interesting cases of hypocrisy. There's one particular group. It's actually headed by an Englishman called Alex Benjamin. The name of the group is Europe Israel Public Affairs, and it has been presenting Israel as a very liberal country. Every year when the gay pride event takes place in Tel Aviv, they celebrate this. Yet some of their most hawkish supporters in the European Union, in the European Parliament, are Christian Zionists who are completely opposed to homosexuality, who are completely bigoted against gay people. So this, this to me is a very flagrant case of hypocrisy. Yet these people seem to be able to live with it for whatever reason.
A few years ago, the first council in Scotland. I should have done my research for this. I'll post a note at the end, David. But the first council in Scotland that had a full BDS policy was West Dunbartonshire. And after a few years, the pro-Israel groups were quiet, and then they whipped up a campaign a couple of years later, during which, if I get the guy's name, you may be able to produce it, the European Jewish Organization, self-styled, but very Zionist, led by a multimillionaire, said that Scotland was very similar to Nazi Germany. Tony Blair's now gone to work for this group in terms to combat anti-Semitism. Now, anything Blair touches, of course, immediately a lot of people are suspicious of. But would you like to comment on that, David?
Yeah, I think the name of the group you're referring to is the European Jewish Congress, which presents itself as a kind of a communal organization and has been accepted, unfortunately, by some European Union's bodies as such. But it really is a pro-Israel lobby group. It's headed by a man called Moshe Kantor.
That's right, Kantor. Kantor said Scotland was very like Nazi Germany.
I don't recall him saying that, but it's true that he's very friendly with Tony Blair, and he did actually hire Blair as the head of a particular initiative against anti-Semitism that he was.
Tony doesn't come cheap, by the way. There must be some serious dosh there.
I think. I'd have to check this, but I think this was actually one of his honorary job, one of his pro bono activities. But I'd have to double check this. But I think at the time, a few years ago, I think he actually said that he wasn't going to be drawing the salary for this particular post. And he hasn't been very visible as part of that post. But were you inviting me to? I know we haven't got too much longer, but were you inviting me to say a little bit about Tony Blair as well? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, you must know what the shadow he casts in Brussels.
I'll try and keep this as brief as possible. And maybe this is an opportunity just to say a tiny bit about Brexit as well. Of course, I mean, the whole Brexit, of course, one of the arguments that you've seen in the British press over many years has been that the European Union is the boss of Britain and so on, that it's a question of control, that the European Union, Brussels controls Britain too much.
Straight bananas and square tomatoes, they're forcing them on us.
Kippers, etc., etc. The reality is a little bit more complicated than that. The reality is that Britain has actually been a member of the European Union with full voting rights since the 1970s. And to try and keep things as focused as possible on Palestine, the European Union, Britain has actually had a marked effect on some aspects of European Union policy making, particularly, I would argue, on the development of the European Union's foreign policies, and even more particularly, again, the development of the European Union's policies on Palestine. In the late 1990s, at the beginning of this century, the aforementioned Tony Blair was, of course, Britain's Prime Minister. As Britain's Prime Minister, Tony Blair was instrumental in setting up the European Union's first so-called security operation in Palestine. The operation in question is known as EUPOL COPS, C-O-P-P-S. It's a policing operation. Its objective has been to support the Palestinian Authority's police. Why is this problematic? To put it bluntly, it's problematic because it has reinforced cooperation between the Palestinians and their occupiers. The operation has been sold as helping the Palestinians get ready to assume the responsibilities of statehood. But in reality, it has been all about making the Palestinian Authority more subservient to the Israeli occupation. And interestingly enough, among the sinister, I know we don't have too much longer left, but among the sinister aspects of this project is that it was actually established with the help. Its first head was a man called Jonathan MacIver. Jonathan MacIver had been previously a senior police officer in Southeast London, in the area where a young black teenager called Stephen Lawrence was murdered during the 1990s. And Jonathan MacIver was actually heavily criticized in the report of the Macpherson inquiry, the official inquiry into the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. They basically came to the conclusion that he had not acted appropriately. He was the most senior uniformed officer on duty in Plumstead, in the area where Stephen Lawrence was murdered. The official inquiry into the murder concluded that Jonathan MacIver had not acted appropriately on the night of that murder. Despite that, Mr. MacIver was appointed to head the European Union's first security.
I think you've been very restrained in your description of MacIver and the dark shadow that hung over him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm kind of paraphrasing what the inquiry said. Jonathan MacIver also served in the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the north of Ireland, which was a very oppressive police force in the north of Ireland, and indeed most of the men who have headed this European Union policing operation in the West Bank to date have also served in the RUC. So, which suggests that the European Union Britain and the European Union have been exporting repression from the north of Ireland to Palestine. The tactics that the Palestinian authorities, police force have used bear some resemblance to the tactics with which the Catholic community in the north of Ireland became grimly familiar during the Troubles. So, you know, this is all something that started because Tony Blair sponsored it. Britain provided the personnel and most of the finance for this operation in its first year. So it was really a British initiative that was taken, that had a European Union logo on it, for want of a better way to describe it. You know, and this is among many things that Britain has contributed to the European Union's policies on Palestine. So, you know, Britain has actually played a very negative role inside the European Union. Unfortunately, this is something that, you know, if there had been a truly free press in Britain, or at least a press that was willing to examine things from a critical and a comprehensive perspective, these are among the issues that should really have been debated ahead of your referendum a couple of years ago. Yet instead, unfortunately, that referendum became a very kind of toxic slanging match on largely about immigration and so on. You know, it wasn't a proper informed debate about what the European Union is and what Britain's role in the European Union has been.
David, let me invite you to make some concluding remarks, and if I could just make a couple of points. I spoke to, well, I didn't, but some of our members spoke to one of your colleagues who writes really excellent stuff about the Middle East. And he said to them that he used to, I know you write for the Wall Street Journal, to get stuff in the Guardian, the Irish Times and so on. He said that he used to be published widely in the mainstream media in Britain as before he knew what he was talking about. But that once he really learned what was going on, those columns were closed off to him. How do you manage to balance that? And finally, you've got an Irish sensibility to what Britain did there. Britain slaughtered its way through Aden, invades Egypt in '56. The French killed 1 million Algerians before they were driven out. When these leopards hunt in a pack in the EU, they don't change their spots. So is there any reason why we should expect Europe, which has behaved with such savagery towards the peoples of the Middle East, to have any sort of benign approach once they're grouped together in the EU? If you could deal with that and make concluding remarks according to how you feel, David.
Fine, yeah, which explains why I haven't written for The Guardian for a number of years. The second question about should we? Yeah, well, look, the European Union at the moment includes Britain, it includes France, it includes Belgium, includes Portugal, includes the Netherlands. I could go on. All those countries have got histories of imperial savagery.
Yeah.
You know, Britain and France together in 1916 got together and decided how to carve up the Middle East into spheres of influence. More than 100 years later, a lot of that imperial thinking persists. Indeed, some of the people behind the Brexit project have actually talked about resurrecting imperialism. Some people like Jacob Rees-Mogg are totally unapologetic, as far as I can see, about Britain's imperial history. With that kind of baggage, it's not surprising that, you know, and of course, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, Britain and France really are responsible for the the foundation of the state of Israel. It's and have continued to be protective of that state. So we shouldn't really be surprised that the European Union is tends to side with Israel. And just to emphasize, it's worse than that. The European, I put it quite mildly there. The European Union, to reiterate what I said earlier, is complicit in Israel's crimes against humanity. Our tax, I know people in the United Kingdom will soon be leaving the European Union, but they still ought to know that their money has been used without their permission to fund Israeli bodies that are directly involved in the occupation and in.
David Cronin, I want to thank you for doing this interview. Please keep patrolling the beat in Brussels and managing to be a full-time professional reporter and telling the truth about what's going on there, when opportunities in the media for telling the truth seem to be closing down all over the place. David Cronin, please keep up the good work. It's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. I warmly recommend your book, Balfour's Shadow, your 2011 book. What's the precise title? How the EU...
The title was Europe's Alliance with Israel.
Yes, I'm away from my library here in China at the moment. So from David in Brussels and me in Shanghai, thank you very much for viewing. The recording will be up on the Facebook page in a very few minutes. It'll be slightly polished and edited, and it'll be up on the SPSC website in a very short time indeed. Once again, thanks very much to David Cronin for being interviewed this week. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Mick.